Okay, so I'm back here with the neck. It is approximately 9 to 10 hours later than when I put on the first coat, and that thin coat soaked in nicely. Beautiful, smooth finish. You can use that thin coat on its own and just put on a few layers, but my preference is really to get the kind of matte feel that you get with the 3031. And this finish does separate, so you do want to give it a stir. Make sure it's well mixed. You can see there kind of that cloudy appearance. That's the wax component into the finish, and the matte part of it. All right. So the application with this finish is pretty much the same as the one I did this morning. The difference is I'm going to put it on a little bit thicker, and it will leave a fair bit of finish on the surface, and that's okay, because what I'm going to do is let it sit again. 7 to 8 minutes is what I'm looking for, and then I'm going to come back and buff off all the extra finish that I've left on the surface. And the trick I find with this stuff is to get it before the wax portion really starts to harden. And if it gets too dry and hard, then it becomes difficult to wipe that wax, kind of the waxy residue, off, and you just have to work at it a lot harder. Now again, this is different than what they suggest for applications for like floors and that sort of thing, where you just actually kind of leave it and just let it dry without going back to buff it off. But what I'm looking for is a perfectly smooth finish, like I said at the start of the video, right off the rag. And I didn't really point it out, but I did not do anything after the first coat. I didn't do anything to prep this. I'm just going straight from the first coat to the second coat. And as long as you wipe off the residue, it will leave a perfectly smooth surface. I should say that before you put on your second coat like I'm doing now, you want to give whatever you're finishing a close inspection for any scratches or anything that you might have missed before applying the first coat, because once the first coat is on, all those things will really show up. Key places to look are just in the transitions, but whether it's a guitar neck or whether it's something out, look at corners, transitions, places that are difficult to sand, and make sure that you haven't left anything there that you're going to regret later. I did take a good look at this neck before starting the video. It looked good. And as I'm applying the finish, I'm just kind of going back over the areas that I've already done, and I'm just kind of smoothing it around. I don't really want to leave any dry spots at this point. And I'm just about done. It takes a couple minutes to cover the whole neck, and what it means is I'm probably going to let it dry for 5 minutes to 6 minutes, and then I'm going to start buffing it off where I applied it first, and then work my way back towards the heel of the neck where I'm applying the finish now. And that way I'm not really letting it sit anywhere on the neck for more than that 7 or 8 minutes. And like I said, conditions in your shop may either speed or slow the drying process, so you want to be aware of that. I'm putting it on thick, but at the same time I don't want drips, so I'm always going back and checking, just making sure that I'm not leaving any where I don't want it. Alright, so I've pretty much covered everything. Examine it under my lights. Like I said, I lacquered the front of the headstock, which will later get sanded and buffed. I just want to make sure I haven't dripped anything on the edges. If there is, just wipe that off now. That won't be a problem. And I'm going to go ahead and set my timer for about 5 minutes, and be back. Okay, so it's been about 6 minutes since we applied the coat of matte finish. Still pretty wet looking, although there is certain spots where it is starting to appear dry, but that's okay. This is kind of where I want to catch it. When the whole thing starts to dry, like I said, it gets difficult to rub it back. So I've got a bunch of clean paper towels already cut here, and I'm just going to go ahead and start wiping that residue off. Constantly rotating paper towel to get a clean section. And what I like to do is I'll actually put a paper towel down on my bench just so I can rest the corner of the headstock on it there. Lets me get at the side a bit better. And it should feel nice and smooth when you've buffed any of that excess wax off. If there's chunks or anything that are drying, you'll kind of catch on them. But once you kind of get those chunks dislodged in that, then it just wipes off nice and clean. You should be able to rub your rag around without really feeling any stickiness or resistance. You just want kind of the dry surface that's left. Again, carefully setting the corner down on my bench. Try and keep this in the shot, but just carefully wiping around the heel. I'm going to switch to a new wipe here, and making sure I get all the little bits, corners of the fretboard. As I said with the previous coat, it is okay to handle it. It's just good to go back and just buff the area. If you do touch a certain area with your gloves, just go back and buff that with the rag. Keep turning it around, checking it in the light. You're looking for liquid or shiny spots that remain. And I think we pretty much have this, which is great. This is the second coat for day 1, so I will now let this dry overnight, and we'll come back to it tomorrow morning for coat 3. And I'm actually going to do that off camera, so when we come back, it'll be just before coat 4. Okay, so here we are back with the neck. It now has the 3 coats of the oil, 1 of the thin, 2 of the matte finish, and you could leave it at this stage and consider it done. I like to put on the 4th coat just to get a little bit of extra build, extra protection there. No difference between coats 2 and 3 as far as the fact that I'm not doing anything on the neck, in between. As far as surface preparation, but before the final coat, I like to take some ultra-fine steel wool and just give the neck a very quick going over. If you feel it with your hand, you can just feel, I don't know, maybe it's just not perfect. I can feel my fingers catching in a few spots, and if I run the steel wool over it, it just gets nice and smooth, and that's just going to ensure that our last coat goes on as smooth as possible. Again, if you're using a true lint-free rag and you have a fairly clean environment, you shouldn't have much in the way of surface imperfection, and that's just why I'm giving this a very quick going over. But make sure that you get all parts that you've finished, and again, very lightly with extremely fine steel wool. That way, you're not going to break through the finish on any of the corners or anything, and it's just really nice and smooth at this point. So final thing, whether it's a tack cloth, or sometimes I just take one of my lint-free cloths with just a teeny bit of water on it, just enough to get it lightly damp. You want to go back over it and make sure you remove any little bits of the steel wool that are left behind. You could use an ultra-fine abrasive pad or something. I think the white ones, the 3M white pads, are kind of the equivalent to the ultra-fine steel wool. I just happen to have the ultra-fine steel wool. And again, I'll just wipe it down a couple times. Hardly any water on my rag, just enough to pick up anything on the surface. And there we have it. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the fourth coat, or the third coat of the matte, and application is the same as what I've shown you previously. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that, and then I'll come back once this is dry just to give a final look at it. Okay, so I'm back here with the neck that I've been finishing with the Osmo Oil, and this is actually somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks later since the last clip, and the guitar is now finished. See this beautiful mahogany guitar and the neck. And so the neck, as you see it here, is the straight off the last coat of oil. So right off the rag, I've done nothing to treat it after that other than to let it dry. You can handle the Osmo Oil after it's had about 12 hours to dry. I just handle it lightly, but I prefer to let it dry at least 3 or 4 days before I really start to handle it. And they say it takes approximately 2 weeks for it to fully cure, but I find that after 3 or 4 days it is plenty hard enough to be handled while the guitar is being assembled. So once you've applied your final coat, whether you're going with 3 coats or 4 coats, always good to check for imperfections. And you can feel it pretty easily. The neck here is silky smooth, just terrific. Where you might feel something is where there's end grain. So if you're finishing a guitar, you're going to get that potentially around the headstock or around the heel block. And if it is particularly rough for some reason, you can take some steel wool. I would use probably extra fine and just go over it very lightly. I find that if I use the extra fine steel wool on the Osmo Oil matte finish, as long as I'm very light with it, it blends in really well. If you go at it too hard, you will kind of polish it up, change the sheen a bit, and it will become noticeable. So as much as possible on the last coat, I prefer just to apply it with the rag and then not to touch it. And again, as long as you follow the previous steps, it should be great. One other thing I'll point out, again, being that this is an ebony fretboard guitar, I'm going to turn the backlight off. We treated the neck with the thin Osmo Oil to start with, and then followed that up by the matte finish. And what I find is when finishing a wood like ebony, so this is going to be a oily or extra dense type hardwood, I do find that as it dries, there is a little bit of residue that can form on the surface, and it's kind of the waxy residue component that's in the matte finish, and it only forms on the ebony, and it's just a little bit. And if you're just looking at it, you'll see that the light will just catch it a little bit differently, and if you run your finger along it, it might catch a little, just not be as smooth. No big deal there. Just take a clean dry cloth and just buff it, and all you'll have to do is just run your rag up and down a few times like this. It'll take off any little bit of that waxy residue that may still be there, and as the finish totally dries, that waxy residue will not be an issue or not continue to form, but you may notice it forming over the first couple days after the finish. So there you have it. Quick professional finish using Osmo Oil products. Highly recommend them. And if you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Model overviews, kind of behind the scenes building info, and some instrument demos as well. Thanks for watching.